It's June 22nd. It's Wednesday, June 22nd, 2022. Watching See the BS this morning. And on it, they have a thing about campaign ads, and they mentioned something about Communications Act of 1934. Again, as a thing, or as a verb, as an action piece, an action pawn, an action whatever, figure, being myself, inside of this larger socially engineered whatever area that seems to be miswired and seems to be misled or misrouted in some way. I'm thinking back to the education I received. I'm taking that education and I'm basing off of my parents and my son to see where generationally we're at for a baseline. I'm then looking out to the television, the teleprompter, for what others have received in enrichment and enlightenment and how their success ratio or survival ratio is going and looks like another baseline to the treatment I've received that seems unfair and unjust whatsoever. Yesterday, Lewis invited me with Joe on an errand, so I went. They went to get pool supplies for Joe's pool. So we drive out of Queens all the way far to Massapequa to Island Recreational. In the car, Joe brings up a fact of telling me about his life. He's telling me that he was the first person to graduate high school, and then he went to college in his family. But the first person to ever graduate high school. I was like, all right. And he said that he became a teacher. He made around $70,000 to $80,000. That was his max salary. But again, money mechanics where they were, he was able, between him and his wife, it was sustainable. Then he said that he had a friend, Roger, who's a bus driver, who made $130,000 as a New York City bus driver. So when I'm speaking of making $28,000 and $38,000 in the banking industry, while a bus driver's making $130,000, and I have no idea, nor do I really want to drive a bus for a living, especially with what they have to go through in New York City nowadays. The money mechanics are all over the place and all off. So then he was asking me about my high school experience. And I said, well, I got to St. Dominic's in 9th grade. I wore a uniform. I really liked that. They had 2 years of really great education, I thought, based on how little I was learning before that. And then, as far as like earth science, like they had really interesting topics for once. And it was a different environment. I was able to, and this is the difference between the North Shore and the South Shore. I was actually able to recall at times the information better than I was the first however many years. The first however many years that they held me in Lloyd Harbor and then Cold Spring Harbor. It was almost like as soon as I learned the information, it just evaporated into thin air, into the Dyson sphere, and just taken away. And then God only knows what they do with it in analysis and cerebral whatever. But in St. Dominic's, there was a uniform involved, which I liked. Being a skirt every day and a button-down collared shirt and a blazer. And then there was specified timeliness. There were boundaries drawn. There was, here's our curriculum. We're going from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. At the end of the year, you expect to take a Regents. You pass the Regents, you pass your class. That's it. Loved that sense of, and Mrs. Brancato was the principal. I thought she was, I mean, the principals in the school are kind of absent out of your daily life, but we had sat with her and she seemed like a very organized person, which I really, really enjoyed. I don't think I ever met the principal of Cold Spring Harbor High School. I don't know who that was. Didn't have a name, didn't have a face. So, but in 11th grade, I went back to Cold Spring Harbor High School, and then it was even worse. It was just, you get your class, there was no like mentorship, no guidance, no anything. They handed you the schedule, and then that was really it. It was just getting through class. There was no talk of college. I never even heard the word. There was some test, instead of the Regents in 11th grade, we had to prepare for something called an SAT. No idea what that was for. It was a type of Regents, I suppose. And then you get a numbered score on that, though, that then's important for some carry forward thing. And then senior year, Lou lost the business or whatever, and we had to move out of Cold Spring Harbor, and moved back to Queens. So now I'm in Queens, and I go to register. Now all of a sudden, this number score of this SAT thing was important. But again, like, these were not things talked about. I didn't have parents that went to college. They expected the school to inform me. Lou tells the story all wrong. I go to St. John's for registration in Queens, in Astoria. Again, a uniform. Although their uniform was really sloppy. Their uniform was like you could wear a long skirt, a short skirt. White button-down shirt was required always. But it could be a tan skirt, it could be a black skirt, and then, like, blazers are optional. What the hell kind of Catholic school is this? And then they had no theology. I'm like, this is just weird. But again, this is Queens. This is like a whole new animal, so I'm like, whatever. And then they were like, you either join the service or college. And I'm like, what's the difference? I mean, like, again, it's like you're on the spot and, like, nobody's ever even had the... Then Joe's saying last night, he's like, these words like matriculated and unmatriculated. I'm like, what's the difference? He's like, well, one you get credit, one you don't. I'm like, right, okay. So, again, like, all these things, like, the humans don't talk about. They apparently know, but they don't talk about. And then you're there, and there's been no planning for, like, here's the deal. You enter kindergarten, and this is what the course of your studies are going to look like. Here's your focus. There's been no focus. And I'm like, well, where's the preparation for the world? Like, how am I going to fit in and function? There's nobody to ask. So Joe says last night, so he's like, well, how did you find the colleges then? And I'm like, I don't know. I asked the person at guidance in senior year because now I'm at the edge of the cliff and I have to get to next year. I was like, so I asked them, well, how do you pick a college? Well, they're like, well, you have to fill out applications and write essays. I'm like, yeah, okay, well, that's whatever. I was like, but how do you pick a name? How do you pick a location? How do you pick, like, they're like, well, what do you like to do? What hobbies do you have? I'm like, I have nothing. I'm like, there's been nothing. I was like, I mean, I played a couple of sports. I was like, but nothing like championship, professional, nothing like really like whatever. I'm like, so it was more for like exercising just so I didn't have to go home so early and sit in my room. So now, like, where's this? I mean, like, coordination, they had absolutely none at school. It was, I mean, like, they had a body there. Not that it was helpful. And then, there was, I'm like, you have, like, a list? I mean, like, they're like, well, do you want a state school? Do you want an Ivy League school? Do you want, and I'm like, how do you know that? I'm like, what's the difference? I'm like, what is the difference between a state and an Ivy League school? Like, who decides these things? How did they build the system prior to my arrival? When they were completely ignorant of my parents' need as Rh negative carriers. And they were just misleading them and letting them just wing it or try to figure it out with two broken wings. I'm just curious, when I arrived at that spot in 1995, last year before like the end of the set amount of time that they hold you captive in New York State for some reason. I mean, it's like, I mean, at that point it's like do or die, and then you can't even get a representative to tell you, well, how's the system set up? What's an Ivy League? What's a state school? What's the difference? What are my options? What's it going to look like? What does it equate out to in my life? All things the guidance counselor or mentor completely unprepared to answer. Why is that? So that happened. So I had a conversation with a real human who's non-familial about that yesterday. And it's just so frustrating. So then I'm looking to my son's education, my youngest son's educational program now that I'm here in nothingness. And they came home with a study guide for the Civil War. And I'm like, now, again, it just says northern states, southern states. It doesn't say anything about United States. It doesn't say anything about the USA territory. It doesn't say anything about North America. It just says Civil War. And I'm thinking of the visuals that I saw the other day about African Civil War that went on in the 1990s while I was in this position of regency, but at short clips that led nowhere. And I'm like, and then I'm thinking back to my junior year, which is 11th grade, in Cold Spring Harbor High School, the 1 year that I spent there. And I had Healy as a study hall teacher. I didn't know what study hall was. And I didn't know why that was on my schedule, since I needed like some kind of whatever. But there were seniors in my study hall, and I was only a junior. And there was talking that went on. I mean, they said that it was an extra class for them to study what they had missed. I'm like, right, okay. But it was a bunch of senior guys that were in the class. They were the ones, I think, who told me about driver's ed. That was their contribution or their enrichment or whatever. But I think I was supposed to go to something called Global Studies, and then they canceled Global Studies. Don't know why that was. It was on my schedule, then it wasn't. Changed to study hall. I don't know. There was some weird stuff going on. There usually is. But also, like, there was no theme. Like, there was no state. I don't think there was a state-sponsored theme. There was not, like, a religious necessarily sponsored theme that I was aware of or spoken about. It was just this, like, benign, bland curriculum. with no center focus. Like, so pivotally, it's just, I don't know. It's been incredibly detrimental, I feel, to my future. But again, that's just seems to be this thematic here. And it says, why did the Civil War begin? Causes: the opinion of slavery, states' rights, and territorial expansion. Westward expansion of slavery to new states. So is that what I'm experiencing now? Because, like, there's not been a leader in my life frame that has been able to, like, itemize out and be like, listen, kid, here we are. What you were experiencing then was that we had no clue what we were doing, no clue what we were in for, no direction whatsoever. There was a whole lot of nothingness going on, so we kind of put you on ice for, like, I don't know, 13 years in isolation, so you wouldn't have this mental disease of what you thought the world was according to some problems that were going on and erupting around the world before you arrived. And so now we haven't been able to get to you just yet because we're too busy doing bread and circus tricks for, like, not, like, dying kind of a thing. And we're sending you some teleprompter messages, and we're hoping you can decode it, save the future. For your kids. For your own kids. Forget about everybody else. Right, yeah, because that's kind of what it looks and feels like from the middle of my mother's bedroom, with not wanting to enter this world, not wanting to enter this dimension, not wanting to enter into any of the human activities or non-activities, I mean, that I've been allowed or disallowed. I mean, it's really confusing how to explain this. And then I'm watching this, and it goes from these political ads and this Communications Act of 1934, which, like, nobody can even describe to me, what does the word political mean? How is it built? I mean, it has some millenare, like, I mean, I won the lottery with the historian the other day. He's like, it's not military, it's a different word, that's mill. I'm like, you mean millenare? He goes, how did you know that? Like, actually, I don't think he asked me how I knew that. He was just like, yes, actually. That's exactly what it is. And I'm like, right, okay, so, I mean, like, I was just thirsty for, like, the enrichment that this man had that I have been deprived of. And again, debauchery comes into light, but I don't want it to be used haphazardly. That's like a reserve word. So I'm watching this, and then it goes back to, there's something called cerebral, and they put on their medical officer and CEO, and I'm like, this, and they show about a woman who says that she has, I mean, like, because I've gone through the gamut with them. It's like, I'm not feeling well. They're like, well, maybe it's depression. Maybe it's a mental disease. Maybe it's this. And I'm like, maybe it's not, and the world's just not right, because I didn't enter a perfect system. And now I have money-making, like, producers trying to theorize, and he even says at the end of his bit, he says, well, it's a thesis. Right, it is a thesis. It's a hypothesis that somebody's funding and allowing to try out and medically practice on the public. It gets to be a problem. So here, this is what this part looks like.
I love that story.
Very happy.
Yeah.
He's impressing her.
See the girl next to the guy? She's like, oh my God. So emotional.
I don't know what their relationship is.
And she goes, I like him a lot. Yeah, because you can tell he's a nice guy.
Well played.
Yeah,
well played.
yeah.
Well played.
All right, we're going to begin this hour with something I've been wanting to talk about for a while now, political advertising. You may have seen this new online ad from Missouri U.S. Senate candidate Eric Wright.
Now, I should say, before they did this piece, I had never seen any of these things. Because there's some algorithm, there's something in the internet. I mean, I call my specific internet MaxiPad. just because the acronym works. With the I, it's a max and it's a pad, and I am in that equation somewhere in the physical and kinesthetic world between Rishus, Ace, stereo, and heliosphere in some orbital whatever. Just so cerebro and cerebral at like X-Men and like, I don't know, the gods from the great beyond.
Take a look. It shows the former GOP governor holding a gun and supposedly hunting moderates in his own party, calling them rhinos. That would mean Republicans in name only.
Now, that definition of rhino, first time I've ever heard it. I've never heard it acronymed out that way. But then again, I don't have anybody to talk to that's intelligent. I mean, because I know there's like sub-intelligent groups. Like they clan together, they dine together, they run together like packs of wolves. I have no idea where my pack went. Like they just disappeared. And it's really frustrating.
Facebook has banned the ad and Twitter flagged it for abusive behavior. But guess what? If his campaign was to buy commercial advertising slots on local TV, an industry expert tells us that CBS news stations would have to air it. And that is for sure true when it comes to lies. Several candidates in other states have already used TV ads to repeat false claims of fraud in the 2020 election. And now you might think that broadcast stations like this one could...
Now, this is interesting. The only Purdue I've ever seen on TV or heard about in the field is Frank Purdue, who looks more like Eli Manning than he does anyone else in the field of New York. But there's this other gentleman, David Purdue, now that I can see today with the name. Looks very different. It doesn't look like the chicken guy, Frank.
Would reject such outright lies. But in fact, we have no choice but to air them no matter how blatant or misleading. Be advised.
The liberal pro-Biden, pro-China Wall Street insider.
Every election year, it seems like politicians hit us with a 1-2 combination of spin,
Alex Mooney repeatedly disrespects veterans.
and scorn.
Now here's the thing. There's no integration with whatever's paying for this, whatever's fighting at some Succession or billionaire level boys club. There's no way of like contacting them. I mean, they'd have to find you. But yet then they want to vote. But they only, with myself, I've only been allowed to vote once every 4 years for 2 people that they put up. And it's like, pick like, what face do you want? Or you going by party lines. I mean, but it doesn't say what the party's about. Doesn't speak of what the party has done. Doesn't speak about who's involved. Like, there's no names that are prominent. There's until a ticket gets put up, and then it's like one face, one name. But you don't know anything about them. You don't know what they're into, how they've helped, how they've poisoned the land, the scenery, who they're begging for money. None of this is even talked about. I've never learned it. I've never been an integrated part of it. But yet it functions somehow while I'm stuck here with, I went through this socially expected whatever of enriching or enlightening, which in whatever format they allowed, but yet they haven't allowed me to participate even though I went through the first part of the initiation phase. It's a little confusing how they're running the show.
It's dangerous and irresponsible.
It's all part of a long tradition of using the public airways to persuade, and you might even say manipulate, American voters. 3, 2, 1. But while while your regular, everyday commercial advertisers can sometimes face allegations of stretching the truth,
You'll get the best 5G network.
they're at least
Now, this scares the heck out of me because from that platform, there's magnetic problems between the top of this antenna system and the floor, and it separates what would be the Dyson sphere. And that middle ground manipulation in magneticism is affecting the animals, being the humans, below.
are at least required by federal law to back up their claims with facts. You should know those rules do not apply to political candidates.
Don't assume that the political ad that you hear contains true information.
Joseph Watson guided the George W. Bush administration on telecommunications policy and is now a professor at the University of Georgia.
Just so you know, I was available. During George Bush's administration, I could have held that position. But for some reason, I wasn't. Just so we're clear, if I have to call out, like, direct, somehow they gave it to this guy. Which seems to be an ongoing theme of some control and some major issues going on in New York and in other towns around the United States of America territory.
So a cereal company can't lie about their cereal, but a candidate can lie about their politics.
That is absolutely true.
And lately, he says the lying has gotten both bolder and more frequent.
It has not been historically as much of a problem prior to 2016. I would say after 2016, the world has changed a lot.
Watson.
2016, the world has changed a lot. You know when else it changed? I went to school with a girl by the name of Lynn Lackner. Lynn and I went to school. The other girls absolutely hated her. She was a white girl. She was tall. She was beautiful, green eyes, petite nose, and thin. Other girls hated her. I didn't really care. Wasn't particularly fond of the other girls. So Lynn and I were friends, and she dropped out of St. Dominic's, went to a local public school in 11th grade, got into a BOCES program, and was able to obtain her associates at the same time she got her high school diploma. So she did 2-in-1 education. I had no idea what it meant until after. She just left school, didn't show up, so there's no asking her. And then I ran into her later on somehow. Well, I was trying to attend college the old-fashioned way of going through high school with no purpose whatsoever. So she was already making like around $25 an hour, and I was just entering college, putting myself into debt, and not having a job, a career, even a field of study at the same time. Just so like different life paths are there. So, and then when I did go for nursing around 2001 to 2003 timeframe, the barriers to entry for my white person was so obvious. They changed the application time. They only took a certain bit. There was big waiting periods. If you didn't get, you had to take all the prerequisites before you get to nursing school. But there's a specific timeline and only so many applications you can put in. And if you don't hit the lottery system and get a seat, and at the same time, they were going through a nursing shortage crisis, and then they found all these like Trinidad, Guyana, and all these other, and then they just flew in all of these non-American nurses, and they filled a gap that I was trying to get through school, but the barriers were there, so I couldn't graduate. And that's a big key time, somewhere between 2000 and 2003, where a big influx of Guyanan and Trinidad people came in, and all the barriers seemed to be removed from them for some reason. But I still did not succeed in the field for which I was trying to enter. However, it worked because it was working for Lynn, and she was able to afford her own apartment. She was able to afford herself and had a higher entry level salary than I ever got or ever was able to obtain. And she was able to get her degree before she even graduated high school at the same time, rather than having to waste more time and more life in some useless scenario going into debt and not having any like career position like in the end of all of this debt to know what she could expect to make, what companies had already hired her or were looking forward to employing her. Like, the system is so corrupt. And here we are at your political ads.
And points to commercials like this one from President Biden's 2020 campaign.
If Trump gets his way, Social Security benefits will run out in just 3 years from now.
It earned 4 Pinocchios from the Washington Post fact checker, a rating reserved for whoppers.
The thought of American...
Those seem like Interpol, like foreign national policing terms inside of the whatever, in some, like, yeah, we told them it was up there, we paid for some advertising, so like nobody has to actually take responsibility.
Americans who are living on fixed incomes thinking that's going to go away is terrifying.
Yeah. And here we have that lie approved by Joe Biden.
Absolutely, yeah.
But of course, not all lies are created equal. In this election cycle, there's one lie above all the others.
We won by a lot, not just a little bit. We won by a lot.
A lie that stands out in terms of sheer repetition.
Blue state liberals stole the election from President Trump.
I'll make sure our elections are never stolen again.
The amount of misinformation we're seeing in the midterm cycle is more than I've seen.
You know what other truth I have? My lie has a number on it, an interstate. It also looks like the spine of the fish.
Seen in the past in a presidential election cycle. That's what concerns me about 2024. If this is what the midterm looks like, and the ads are this aggressive and contain so much misinformation, what is it going to look like in the 2024 presidential cycle?
So why, you may fairly ask, would television stations air campaign commercials we know to be wrong?
If you're watching this ad right now, it means you're in the middle of watching a fake news program.
The answer is we must.
This never gets aired on the CBS or on the Eyewitness News that I watch.
And if you don't believe me, here's Bill Whittle, who oversees advertising for our affiliate WFSB in Hartford, Connecticut.
Have you ever rejected a political ad?
No, I haven't.
In how many years?
20.
He showed us how he reviews ads from political candidates.
Is this process being abused? I'm just curious, because, like, if it's supposed to be for international policing and to actually benefit the people at some level from being harmed from places that they couldn't even fathom, and somebody's abusing that process and system, that's an even more frightening detail.
Where I watch the spot to make sure that it conforms to the rules and regulations.
We notice there is an option to reject the commercials, but not for lying.
They have to say it's paid for by, the candidate has to use their name, and it has to be on the screen for at least 4 seconds.
Everything else, fair game.
Pretty much.
The rules were set almost 90 years ago by a law that states broadcasters have no power of censorship over any legally qualified candidate for office, and it requires stations to offer their lowest available rates ahead of an election.
Is it ever frustrating knowing that you have to press play on an ad that has falsehoods in it?
Yes, it is, definitely.
Does that cause any trouble for the station? You get phone calls about it?
We get a ton of calls.
2, 1,
And take it.
In addition to accepting candidate ads, broadcasters must run them without edits. Although, as Watson sees it, there is maybe one potential option for stations interested in flagging ads from candidates.
They could put a disclaimer at the start of an ad that might say, the following is a paid political advertisement that may contain information that's not been verified or validated.
That's an interesting point, but validated by whom?
There should be no preclusion to do that, but the challenge for broadcasters is any disclaimers that they put at the start of an ad can't be paid for by the candidate.
I don't see them doing that.
No.
What about allowing media companies like CBS and the other big broadcasters to step in and reject ads that are false?
Who watches The Watchmen?
Who watches us, you mean? So if you empower a government body to police the truth, that's problematic. If you empower media companies to step in and filter the ads, that's problematic. And so we're left with what we have.
That's exactly right. There really are no easy solutions.
Where I'm standing, and just around me in orbital, is Dio. It's the God space. And then Dia would be this magical wall system of teleprompter carrying information as kind of a bridge inside of this whatever carrying the message.
To resolving this issue, and that's why it's such a conundrum.
No easy solutions. People are only restrained by their own sense of shame. And we should mention that 1934 law applies only to broadcasters on public airwaves, so not cable networks, not social media companies. They are free to remove or reject misleading political content. I wanted to do this piece because I hear from people online who are saying, how dare CBS air that ad? You know there are lies in it. We don't have any choice. It's the law.
This is fascinating.
It doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make sense, and it's eye-opening, but I have a couple of questions. One, who watches The Watchmen?
Yeah.
And I might be asking myself that, looking in the mirror reflection. But then this Communications Act of 1934. Has there been efforts to change it? And is there a slippery slope if you do?
Yeah.
Like, how do you determine what's a lie? Isn't that the big question?
The only option, I think, would be to take the political law from 34 and apply it to cable and online, which would just increase the platforms for ads. It would mean that everybody has to accept everything. The tragedy and the triumph of America is that there is no ultimate backstop to preventing political lies except for the American people.
But the candidates
Trust one
know.
another.
But Tony, the candidates know they're putting on stuff that is a lie.
Yeah.
So when they say my name is Tony DeCopel and I approve this ad,
That means they've approved it. They've approved the lie. They can say anything they want.
They put their name on it.
They put their name on it. It's the only requirement. And they used to be restrained by shame. But shame is a thing from the old days, apparently.
Yeah.
Shame
That was good.
is not a deterrent anymore.
All right, coming up, Marvel actor Simu Liu. He talks about growing up.
All right, now this is this part about Cerebral. They have their medical officer on. Again, does not look North American. However, the products are in North America in a very scary system, but yet he's not American looking or whatever. So it gets confusing as to, so they're here and they're pushing these products inside North America. They have the public like completely oppressed under their business and financial and lawyer savvy, because they seem to like surround themselves at CEO and CMO level with lawyers, but yet the public doesn't. Then they're like, in this instance, this woman went to the doctor, the prescriber gave her a medicine, she broke out in this horrible rash. Then there's the mental disease part of it. Then there's a nurse who was part of them, and the customer service level, and it's almost like these IT or like MIT or Caltech morons program these robots to just answer and brush the public off. So this way, like, billionaires can go out on their yachts and golf courses and like really not have to deal with any of it. It's really a frustrating situation.
Our tickets now to a CBS News investigation of the country's largest online mental health provider. Cerebral offers prescriptions and therapy for conditions like ADHD and depression. It started just 2 years ago and grew.
And so now, if I'm thinking about God of Thunder and this new movie that he did, the Spiderwick thing, or Spiderhead, and now this is coming out Cerebral. If, let's just say for an instance, New York's moving public around in the unsuspecting category is in some outdoor penitentiary, according to whatever you got over there, because they go to see the doctor, they get the prescriptions, and then there's some clinical research, there's some funding, nobody really knows how that works, it's all hush-hush. But then the results are published, but only in like a private community of like, we wasted 8 or 12 years in school. So now we think that we're better than everybody else, and we think that we can oppress the people even more in this weird socially engineered disaster story. So I'm thinking of it on that context when I watch it.
And grew rapidly during
Trapped
the pandemic.
people
Now the
with
Justice
no
Department
other
is looking at
options.
Cerebral's prescribing
Like
practices.
myself, I wouldn't
In an
even know
exclusive
where
interview,
to find the
CEO
lawyer.
Dr. David
What court? What
told
court handles
consumer
this crap?
investigative correspondent Anna Warner that Cerebral is cooperating with the DOJ, and he's confident that the investigation will find no problems. Former patients and employees of the company told Anna other concerns.
And then my other question is this, like last night, we're in this pool store. Joe's buying, my dad's friend Joe is buying these pool snaps for the side of his pool. He just put in a new liner. He's complaining about the prices and how much they've gone up. My father, who doesn't have a pool, has no basis of understanding and is not complaining, and the message is getting completely lost on him. Is like, we're just observing. And it's kind of awkward. I mean, like, we're in somebody else's errands that he runs. I mean, like, he's not our family, but he's my dad's friend, so we're just walking around, and it's kind of awkward, but it's kind of whatever. I'm like, just go about your daily, like, just go about your function. We'll just follow you around. So then then Joe says, something about he needs this vacuum, and like he's doing his Joe things in however his life is functioning, and he's like, he says it's one thing. My dad's like, I think it's COVID, and then he's like, Joe, is it COVID or is it Biden? And there's like a really young representative, like Benjamin's age, maybe Alexander's age or Daniel's, I don't know, somewhere in between, working in Island Recreation, and I'm like, why couldn't it just be a slow boat to China, guys? I was like, why does it gotta be Biden? Why is it COVID? Go with the slow boat to China for this instance. Because, I mean, it's just like all these things, their generation, that they're not talking about because they effed up. They're not telling me the truth. Now I don't have a truth to tell my children in the big lie. And now I have to sit here and try and figure it out, where not only am I midlife crisis, I'm midlife crisis with two parents that lie through their effing teeth about everything because they got no clue, and then they were fed some mental disease, and then they're trying to push that on me and my kids, and I'm like, I'm not buying it, I'm not feeding off of it, just like hush up.
Good morning.
Good morning, Nate. The CEO says Cerebral has saved lives, but our investigation raises questions about how the company treats patients, some of whom told us Cerebral failed them when they were in desperate need of care.
Every single night I want to go to bed, just tomorrow I'm going to do it. I'm going to be better tomorrow.
28-year-old Rachel Coster developed severe anxiety after the birth of her second child.
And then I wake up and I'm home with the kids by myself, and it's just overwhelming.
Then earlier this year, she saw ads on social media like these.
Stigmas and anxiety sometimes prevent people from seeking help.
They were for a company called Cerebral that offers affordable mental health care services online. Coster signed up, met with her prescriber online, and got a prescription all in a single day. But after that,
Every time I needed her help, she was never available.
Like when Coster needed instructions from her prescriber.
See, I just feel this 28-year-old is a vulnerable person in the public. Vulnerable because she has these kids. Again, I don't know her life situation. Did she have proper schooling? Does she have enough money to survive on? Is there a place for her kids in the future? Is anybody even telling her she should think about that? Because I know they weren't telling me. And then here comes these big corporations and these big clinical study, big pharma things. All these words I've heard the public use. And then trying to push her into thinking something's wrong with her to get her to buy medication. But in her case, she even says that it doesn't work. I've tried the medication route myself that the doctors prescribed. Didn't work. Now I'm just like, all right, enough of that. But I had a DHS rep, I think they call it Child Protective Services for myself, I think, after an incident happened. And they went through the bag of prescriptions that the doctors were trying to push on me that I showed I didn't take. I took a few to see if it was helpful or if I felt a difference, which I did not. So I left them in the bag, in the cabinet, but this is what the local doctors are up to.
How to safely switch to the new medication they gave her.
I didn't know what I was supposed to do.
She followed up again and again. 6 days later and still no answer, Coster started the new drug. Then later, she broke out in a rash, a potential side effect for which the drug's maker says patients should call their doctor right away.
And I messaged back letting them know it was spreading and getting worse. And they said that they were still trying to get a hold of that prescriber.
She finally went to the emergency room where doctors treated her with IV steroids and told her to stop taking the medication. She then canceled her Cerebral membership.
They make it seem like they want to help, and then they get you, and they're gone.
Coster is one of over a dozen patients who told CBS News they had problems with Cerebral's quality of care. Dr. David Moe is Cerebral's former chief medical officer and new CEO.
It seems to me this population